Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Albert, and today I'm going to give you a talk about the things to consider when designing forms, using a volunteer sign-up form as an example. Okay. So as you all know, the people around the world today is still experiencing the pandemic, and the people of Brunei had to go through this fight as well. So by late April 2020, almost 2 months after we got our first case in Brunei, we had up to 1,600 volunteers who had signed up with Sukarelawan Belia to assist the nation in the fight against COVID. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Malay, Sukarelawan Belia essentially just means youth volunteers. Okay. Who are they? So Sukarelawan Belia is it's a special task force formed by the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sports, and they were formed after a meeting with the Ministry of Health Emergency Operations Center, that MOHAC, and National Disaster Management Center to assist the front lines in the fight against COVID. So they started the operations on March 18th out of Pusat Bahagia. So to begin with, they had about 17 members, and eventually they reached about 25 members by April. Okay, so at the beginning, the registration and attendance team made use of Google Forms, Google Sheets, Sign Up Genius, WhatsApp, and Telegram to manage the ins and outs of each volunteer. Okay, so I'll now explain some of the issues they face during this process. Okay. So to sign up as a volunteer, you were required, there are quite a few things that you had to provide the team in order for them to determine if you were qualified. So the sign-up form had over 30 questions to be filled in, and this is quite a lot of information to go through. So as there were a lot of questions, there was a lot of opportunity for data to be entered incorrectly, thus giving issues to the team who has to sort through the data. So some of the examples were, giving incorrect personal details. This may include improper IC numbers, fake phone numbers. Some people also registered more than once because they may have forgotten that they had already done so, a few weeks ago. Okay, so this led to a lot of time spent cleaning up the data from the sign-up forms, and ultimately, all of this process information was shared with the entire operations team within a Google Sheet. So this same Google Sheet was where everyone would refer to when they needed to match a volunteer against a specific task. So because there were a lot of people working with this, there was a lot of opportunity for mistakes, like accidental deletions, rewriting fields they shouldn't be rewrites, and so on. So at the peak of the operations, up to April, in a single day, they had to assign up to 400 volunteers across 15 different tasks at around 50 different locations. So this was getting quite hectic for a team of less than 10 to handle. So that's kind of like where we were called upon to assist. So our aim at that time was to ensure that, we wanted to prevent re-registrations. We need to allow new signups to be vetted by the team internally at a much quicker pace than they were doing it. And we needed to reduce the time spent assigning volunteers. And ultimately, we wanted to also get more registrations. So how do we end up improving the sign-up process? Okay, we did this by, preventing duplication, ensuring that the data is validated, making the sign-up itself feel better so that we can, increase the chances of them completing the sign-up. Ultimately, we created a single source of truth that the team can rely on to carry out their day-to-day routine. What it looked like at the end was we had a sign-up form on this website, and the sign-up form itself was broken down into about 10 different sections. Okay, so let's go through the actual form design. Okay, so to prevent duplication, there was two main fields that we had to ensure was unique across the board. So there was a phone numbers and your identification number. Okay, so we did this. So this was not easily done via Google Form, as the only way that I can track if something existed before was through your email address. However, we was very early on decided that we could not use your email address as the main form of identification. So during the sign-up process, we ensured that the user had to check this particular input against the database. So you see here, when they key in their IC number or phone number, they had to click a button to ensure that, to verify that it is still available for use. They could have registered before, or someone else might have accidentally taken it. We also made sure that this form of check was carried out very early on in the process, so that imagine if you went through 9 sections of the form only to find out on section 10 that your phone number, your IC couldn't be used. It would be very unpleasant for the user. Okay. So one very, very important step in any form design is to ensure that the data is validated. Okay. So you can go through this by checking through every input field and thinking about what their basic types are. So it can be a string of text, numbers, date, time, or date and time, or a list of options. Now, if you need to go one step further, we can also consider making use of regular expressions if it has a particular fixed format or structure. An example of this would be, emails. Emails have a structured format. Phone numbers, our local phone number has a structured format as well, and so on. Now, if you attended Desmond's talks earlier, you will be able to, learn how you can use regex in this case. Okay, so we start by looking at, date types. When it comes to dates, it's very good if you can allow the user to make use of a date picker. So this ensures that all the data that will be entering for any date field is consistent and in a fixed format. And if the user still wishes to type in a text as well, a placeholder which clearly indicates the format of the date will be very helpful to them. In this case, we've indicated as month, day, and year. So we also had a birth date input field. Now, besides just the user entering their birth date, this was also used as a means of determining whether or not the user was old enough to participate as a volunteer. So here, we also check that whatever input field I put in, it checks that they are at least 15 years of age. And if they're not, then it would clearly indicate that they're too young to continue on with this form. Okay. Now, here's a very simple and straightforward one, is that if there's any input field within your form that's required to be entered and cannot be empty, just make it obvious that this is the case. So in this example, we just include a red border around it and make it obvious that it's required. Okay, so back to the use of regular expressions. So in this case, we have our phone number field. So for this option, that string of text here just says that, okay, whatever input is coming in here has to match the format where it starts with +673, followed by either 8 or 7, and 6 other digits to follow. So by making sure that the phone number is put in correctly, we can reduce a lot of bad things from happening, because this is something that we will be using, the team will be using later down the track to contact the volunteers. And if it's not put in correctly, then you won't be able to reach that volunteer. So another example will be our IC number, which can follow a strict format. Okay. So moving on, error messages they go hand in hand with form validation. So if something fails, it's very important for you to indicate to the user why the validation has failed and how they can rectify that case. So here we have some examples. So it's back to what I showed earlier. If whatever age they put in, it shows that they're less than 15 years old, make it clear that it failed because they are not above 15 years old. Another one would be if they have not verified the IC number, then it will show, please verify. And if you don't agree to the terms, you're not allowed to proceed with the form. So making error messages as clear as possible is very important to ensuring that the user knows what's wrong and how to fix it. Okay, so now we've done about validation. I'll move on to what we kind of did to make the sign-up itself feel better to improve completion. Okay, so it helps the user when you make it clear which input field they are currently editing. So we do this by making it easily distinguishable with an outer black border. So they're currently active on that. And if this is not active, then it will not have that border. And to add on to that is a lot of people like to complete forms, without having to swap between your keyboard and your mouse too often. So by making sure that your form is keyboard friendly, in this case, by allowing the user to tap to go on to the next field, it removes the need for the user to leave the comfort of the keyboard just to direct the mouse to the next field. Okay. Now more on text fields. If that input field is expected to go beyond a single line, then make sure that you've set it up to be a text area type. This gives the user the ability to look at the entire input as a whole and gives them the ability to adjust the size of the input field if it's still too small. If that was not the case, they would have to painstakingly scroll through the left to see what they typed previously. And doing, for those of you who've done this on mobile, it can be a bit tricky. The gestures that you need to go through to figure out what you've typed, in that single line of text far before. And if this can be avoided, please do so, and you're less likely to be cursed by the user. Okay. So it's also good to include descriptions or guide words to help the user understand what they should be keying into the input. It's also good to utilize a secondary color to differentiate between the input label, the description, and the actual input field. Okay, in this example, just make it clear to the user that the certifications we're interested in here are those that are relating to medical emergency response or national disaster management. Okay. So when you have a predefined list of choices that has a lot of options, we also made it sure that they can both scroll through the list as well as search through the list. Now this allows the user to save a lot of time if they had 100 options to scroll through and they're not quite sure what they're looking for. To add to that, if the input field itself also accepts multiple entries, you can make it such that you can choose all of them in a single input field instead of making multiple fields to collect X amount of information. What I've seen being done sometimes is they have 4 different input fields to choose up to 4 options if you wish. Now, if you only choose one, then you end up having 3 input fields. That just takes up space. So that brings me to the next point, where if it's possible, you only show the user what's required to be filled in by them. Here is a simple one whereby if you had not undergone self-isolation, then this is the only question you have to fill out. However, if you had undergone and you've chosen a yes option, then the next 2 questions will show up where you're required to answer when or where your isolation was. Now, if you consider the language of the users as well, we made sure that our form was bilingual, as people speak and use both Malay and English here. So the user would be able to toggle between either Malay or English at any point in time during the form submission. So because this form itself is quite extensive, as I mentioned earlier, we have divided into about 10 sections. It's always good practice to break down your form into smaller bite-sized chunks. By doing this, you allow the user to be able to focus on the questions at hand. And if you show them the progress, they'll give them a sense of where they're at. Now, I'm not sure if you encountered this before, but if you get a long list of questions presented in front of you, it can be really daunting to go through all of them. So if you can, break it down. So again, with long forms, it's always good to give the user the opportunity to review all of the entries before final submission. If they may require revision to the entry, then allow them to jump back to that specific section. So here in this final step, they can go through all the entries and there's a button to allow them to jump back to the specific section that they want. And it's always good to indicate, especially when you submit the form, include some kind of loading indicator to let them know that something is happening, rather than them, just wondering why the button isn't working and they start smashing it. Okay, so we did go through quite a bit of different things to consider during the form, but guess what? There's still a lot of potential room for improvements. So just a few to point out. We can also introduce input masking. So what input masking is, you make the input field kind of smart a bit to type in extra things that you wouldn't normally. So in this example, we have a credit card field. So normally it's quite confusing to look at 16 digits all in one go. So if you make it such that after every 4, a space is put in, it will make it, a lot easier for the user to distinguish where they're at and what other numbers they're mixing. So you can do this for things like, your passport number, your phone numbers, your IC numbers, pretty much anything that has like a strict format and have things like dashes or slashes. Okay, and when it comes to, when people are doing this for mobiles, it's good to trigger the relevant native mobile inputs. So for example, if you're typing in a field which only accepts numbers, then make sure you bring up the numpad instead of the full keyboard. If you're working with date or time fields, then bring up the date and time input, and they'll be able to easily scroll through, the relevant date and time that they want. It's a lot faster and easier than typing it in. Okay, and now one often overlooked issue is making your form or your website accessible to all people. So here in this example, we're looking at colors. So oftentimes we rely on just making our error messages red to indicate to the user that there's an error. But for those who may be colorblind, this can be quite an issue, because even we have an error here on the left, it's not immediately clear unless they actually read it. However, on the right, we have an example where we've also included an exclamation mark to indicate that there is an error. Now here, back to navigating across a form. So there is a significant portion of people who can only navigate through your form via the keyboard. So things you have to think about would be introducing enunciation or ensuring that the flow of the tab is logical and intuitive. So in this example, we have, we start by the first name, you tap, you go to the last name, and you tap again, it goes to save changes. So these are just some small little things. However, web accessibility in itself is a whole talk on its own, and I don't have much time to go into that here. So we just have that quick summary. So all in all, a text box is never simply just a text box. So there's a lot to consider when you need to collect information from your user. But it's not too difficult if you know what to look for and how to approach it. Best way is to start by finding out how that piece of information you're collecting will be used. And then you can figure out how you can structure your validation or your errors around it. So by ensuring consistent and validated data right at the beginning, we reduce the time spent on work that takes you away from what's more important. Okay. So yeah, today the team has to work with about more than 2,000 volunteers on a day-to-day basis that have about 300 volunteering roles to fill. And now they could end up anywhere in the 150 locations that require volunteers in Brunei today. Yep. So yeah, I'd just like to give a big shout out to the volunteers and the task force who have been helping Brunei in this fight against COVID, as well as helping the frontliners, during this critical period. So yeah, if you're interested to learn out more about this, feel free to join us again in this upcoming conference. So we held virtually, so it's a DAP convention. Normally, you need to pay 15 USD to attend this, but if you want to attend it for free, do get it from us. You can register yourself on that link there, synonymous.io/adapt, or you can just scan the QR code. Yeah, that's it. Do you have any questions? Yep. Uh-huh.
I accept these terms and conditions, and I don't accept this terms and conditions. Hit checkbox, or then you don't accept it, it goes. So the reason why you choose to show it twice, show it as a radio button, just take up the space.
I don't know, good question. I think you can actually do it either way. I don't believe there's a particular reason why we chose radio over checkbox.
It was also explanation for like in that, not in this context, but in a general context. You say adding a checkbox, leaving something unchecked, means the user did not specifically take an action on it. This requires them to take an action on it. If it's like both are blank, the user needs to actually do it. So I think based on some legalese, depending on what you're trying to record, you might need to have, say, the user must have taken an action. So that's where a radio button like this, where they specifically say agree or do not agree, has precedence, as opposed to, oh, I didn't read it, I didn't know I agreed or didn't agree to that phrase. So that's the legal aspect of things that could come into play.
Okay.
Well, don't accept it, usually it just goes in there, like,
Yeah, you can proceed. Yeah.
If it's disabled, if there's a checkbox that's disabled, then the user must take an action on it. But I think the only difference between two is just the checkbox has less words in it, which
It takes less space actually. Yeah. But I think so for those of you who are not here, we had a help from the audience. So essentially, one comment there was that by having it as a checkbox unticked, it could imply that the user did not take any action, and they can, what do you call that? It can be seen as not taking action.
Let's say the group help thing happens pop up where you set some forward, let it go down, checkbox that one. I think it's you have to let's say you switch the agreement to something say this one says I claim that everything that I put inside this form is true, and if it's false, you have the legal right to prosecute for providing fake information or fake evidence. Let's say I give fake information on the form, and when I found that this person actually gives fake information on the form, and you were legally either prison for a month, maybe a fine, or both. If the information that you stated here is false,
Okay, so actually later, at the very last step of the form, you actually have to go through a series of checkboxes to verify those things, that the information you provide is true, that you're once again agreeing to the terms and conditions, and so it's during section 10 on the form that there's 3 additional checkboxes, which in this case we use a checkbox to confirm. But yes.
But if you use that number as just for just now, that is better because it will give you a strict warning to say if you found out that the information is wrong, we have the right to actually pursue the legal case against you for
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So there's a question on the online versions. So Desmond's asking, how do you know which design choices will improve the user experience? Now, to answer his question, to be honest, we haven't gone through the step where we've done a proper, say, A/B testing on whether or not what works and what doesn't. So right now it's mostly just If someone complains about it, then we know something's wrong. And if no one does, then we assume everything's going okay. And so far, we have addressed most of the problems that came up. And what you see today is, the ones where people haven't complained. Okay, thank you, everyone.